just taking this in. It's been a long time, and it's so nice to be back with all of you. All right. I'm imagining everybody smiling behind their mask. That's what you're doing, right? Good, okay. Hello, LeadDev. Look, they gave me the 5 p.m. slot. I'm gonna need a little bit more. Hello, LeadDev. Nice, thank you. I'm Vaidehi. It's so great to be here with all of you. What a first day. What a great first day of this conference, right? Yeah. There have been some amazing speakers, lots of ideas and threads that have connected together. I'm just very excited to be the ending of this wonderful day, and I'm sure tomorrow's going to be great too. I know I'm the last talk, but don't worry. This is not a dense technical talk. I'm not going to do that to you. Instead, I want to offer you a story. But before we get into the story, quick question. How many of you have been to Washington Square Park, which is pictured here? Nice, my people. If you haven't been to Washington Square Park, I have great news for you. If you walk about 15 minutes that direction, it's right there. So be sure to check it out. You can check it out after the conference. It's a beautiful place. And even if you haven't been to the park before, you might have seen it. It might seem familiar to you. Washington Square Park shows up a lot in movies, in TV shows. While researching this talk, I also found out it's referenced in song lyrics, which is pretty cool. It's kind of become a cultural icon in its own way. And it's hard to imagine New York City without this park. It's a bit of a cultural landmark, not just for New York City, but for the entire neighborhood that surrounds it, Greenwich Village. But what you might not know is that Washington Square Park was nearly wiped off the urban map. And that's the story I want to tell you. The year was 1955. Oh yeah, whoever is doing this in the audience, we're getting into it, man. The year is 1955. This guy, whose name is Robert Moses, was the New York City Parks Commissioner at the time, and he was an urban developer. He had a plan he had been trying to execute on for 20 years. You see, he wanted to extend Fifth Avenue South so that it cut right through Washington Square Park. He wanted to divide the park in half. Moses believed that by extending Fifth Avenue south, he could improve the congestion and allow more traffic to flow into downtown Manhattan. But there was another benefit to his plan too, a rather self-serving one. You see, by extending those lanes of Fifth Avenue south, all of the properties south of the park would get this fancy Fifth Avenue address, which would be a nice benefit for urban developers like himself. But there were some people who strongly opposed this plan. They were very much against Moses' expansion. And it was the people of Greenwich Village, those residents. In fact, it was the women of Greenwich Village who spoke up the loudest against this plan. And there was one woman in particular who really led the charge. She's the one in the center here, in the striped shirt, and she's actually standing in the middle of Washington Square Park. This woman spent years organizing the local community and attending community hearings. She gathered the support of local media and politicians, and she eventually got enough of a backing to take Robert Moses to court. And in June of 1959, she won a battle against Robert Moses when the city of New York finally decided to close Washington Square Park to all traffic permanently. And it has been that way ever since. New York City would have looked wildly different if it wasn't for this woman. And if you haven't heard of her before, then let me be the first to introduce you to the phenomenal Jane Jacobs. Jane Jacobs was born in 1916. She started out her career as a stenographer and a freelance writer in New York City. Eventually, she started working as a writer at an American magazine called the Architectural Forum. And that kind of propelled her into this decidedly male-dominated world of urban planning. Throughout her career, Jane was an outspoken activist, and she was a loud critic of many of her contemporaries. She particularly took issue with those urban developers who took a modern approach to urban planning. You see, urban planners of her time, like Robert Moses, tended to take a very rational approach to planning a city. Many of them were inspired by the ideas of the French-Swiss architect Le Corbusier, who emphasized extreme order and symmetry in his urban designs. This is one of his designs from the 1920s. It's called the Radiant City. And in his vision, spaces and buildings were standardized, and they generally served only one purpose. In the Radiant City, the business district was at the center of the city, and there were separate residential and commercial districts. And these districts were connected by transit, but that transit was underground and hidden from view. And there was also an industrial area which was completely separate from all of this. His design was based on these long, massive blocks called superblocks. And rather than green spaces being interspersed throughout the city, all the green spaces were lumped in one specific area. Le Corbusier saw streets as dirty and disgusting and relics of the past. And he thought of automobiles as the future. He once referred to houses as, quote, machines for living in. Yeah, I mean, you're kind of getting a sense of how I feel about him, but well, that's a conversation we can have another time. But he referred to houses as machines for learning in, and I think if you look at his designs for the urban fabric, you can see that philosophy. He also often advocated for demolishing downtowns and the often low-income communities that were next to them, and he wanted to build tall skyscrapers in place of them. Now, Jane was not a formally trained architect or urban planner, but she did spend a lot of time studying cities very closely. And she observed their inner workings, and more importantly, she observed the inhabitants of that city. In the late 1950s, Jane spent 3 years researching and studying city planning and urban life across the United States. In 1961, she published her findings of all that research in a book called The Death and Life of Great American Cities. In her book, she offered an alternative perspective on how cities ought to be planned. And she critiqued urban planners of her time. And she took issue with the fact that their designs didn't take into account what it was like to actually be a human being existing in these spaces. Architects like Le Corbusier designed these spaces the way that they thought people should live in them. Le Corbusier believed that enlightened architecture could help people live an enlightened life. He took a top-down approach to urban design. But Jane approached the problem from the opposite direction. She looked at how spaces were already being used by the inhabitants of a city. And she suggested designs that would be in service of those inhabitants. Although Death in Life was written as a critique of 1950s urban planning policy, it still remains pretty influential today. It's been read by millions of people around the world and used in urban planning syllabuses, and it's been studied by sociologists and designers. And the very first time that I read this book, I didn't know anything about urban planning, and I definitely didn't know anything about the policies that Jane was critiquing in her book. But there was one thing that really stood out to me on that first read. It was the way that Jane talked about cities. She described them as living, breathing entities. She observed that a city was defined by its inhabitants and how those inhabitants used the city and those spaces, and sometimes how they didn't use them. In the book, she writes about the different parts of a city and the roles that those parts play. And I want to focus on just 3 of those today. Specifically, the role of streets, parks, and buildings within a city. In the book, Jane writes what she learned after observing American cities, and she focuses on the parts of a city and how they function in reality, as opposed to how some urban designer or planner wanted them to function when they designed the city. And I think what she discovered tells us a lot about how human beings inhabit and share spaces. So let's start with streets first. I want you to imagine for a moment, what does a vibrant city street look like? What does it sound like? Who's there? What feeling do you get when you're walking down a vibrant city street? For me, the first example that comes to mind are the streets of the Lower East Side. Those streets are rarely empty. There's always something going on. And there's a lot of different things going on, too. There's apartments, grocery stores, cute little niche shops, restaurants, bars, coffee shops, a smattering of small businesses that I've never seen before on like every block. But what's the opposite of that? What does a non-vibrant city street look like and feel like? Well, for me, the first thing that I think of is the financial district. I am not going there unless I have to. Some people in this audience know. The streets of the financial district are like pretty deserted except for when people are there for work. People go there because they have offices there, and maybe they're there during the day. But in the evenings, at night, on the weekends, it's pretty deserted. That's the opposite of vibrance, in my opinion. I think it's the human presence and participation in a city that makes you want to be there. And Jane picked up on this. She viewed the people who lived in a city as active participants of the space. She saw streets and their sidewalks as opportunities for intersection between people. More intersections in the urban fabric led to more interactions between people, and that led to a vibrant city street. And one strategy for fostering more intersections was by creating shorter blocks in a city. When blocks were shorter, you'd end up with a higher density of sidewalks and intersections on that street, and that would increase the surface area that pedestrians could use. There were more opportunities for people in that city to literally come into contact with one another. And this was completely different than Le Corbusier's idea of a superblock. This is an illustration from her book. Jane uses the Upper West Side as an example of a neighborhood with long city blocks. And she observed what happened when residents of this neighborhood interacted with the city. She saw that people on the Upper West Side tended to take the easiest, most direct route to get to their destination. When city blocks are long, there's generally only one direct route that you're going to take to get from one place to another. But when everyone takes the same direct route, whatever that might be for them, that inevitably means that people are taking the same paths again and again and again. And the side effect of that is that they never interact with the rest of the urban fabric. They live in their own isolated bubbles in a way, because they're taking the same path and they don't go beyond what they know. But when blocks are shorter, there are more routes to choose from. This is Jane imagining what the Upper West Side would look like with an extra street cutting through, with shorter blocks. Now there isn't only one direct route to take, there are many. There are new ways to interact with the city. There's new opportunities for intersection. Instead of being isolated to the same paths, the residents of the neighborhood can start intersecting with the neighborhood and exploring the urban fabric in ways that they weren't before. The neighborhood literally is opening up to its residents. And there are larger economic benefits to this design, too. When the residents of a neighborhood venture beyond the same streets that they take every day, they're able to pool their economic power and support these small new businesses and services and shops that inevitably pop up on these corner streets. And because of the surface area of smaller blocks, these businesses don't just survive, they actually thrive. And these intersections become incubators for new and small businesses. However, Jane also notes that we have to be thoughtful about how we add these streets to make shorter blocks. For example, if you have a neighborhood with very repressive zoning tactics, you can add all the streets and create the shortest blocks you want. It's not really going to solve the problem at hand. She reminds us of this when she writes, "Frequent streets are not an end in themselves. They are a means towards an end." Jane was clear about the fact that successful, vibrant cities were those that had spaces that brought people together. But it wasn't limited only to streets. This applied to parks, too. She noted how lots of city planners of her time loved to throw a park in a neighborhood and call it a day. They thought that adding a park would solve all their problems. But as she points out, there are plenty of empty, unused parks all over American cities. If you think hard enough, you can probably imagine one in your own city. These empty parks that go unused are unsuccessful. They're public spaces that are not serving the public. In Jane's view, a successful park was one that was surrounded by mixed-use buildings. A mixed-use building is any structure that serves many different purposes. So it could be a building that has residential purposes, entertainment ones, retail, all in one. Jane noticed that the buildings that surrounded a park directly impacted who used the park and when they used it. Mixed-use buildings are built to serve many different types of people, which in turn encourages a density of people. The density of people is what separates a successful, thriving park from an abandoned, forgotten one. And she uses Philadelphia's Rittenhouse Square Park as an example of this. And this park is surrounded by different types of mixed-use buildings, and there are always people using this park. In the morning, the residents of that neighborhood pass through the park. Maybe they're walking their dogs. Kids pass through the park going to school. People who don't live in the neighborhood pass through the park going to work. Tourists are stopping in the park. People are eating lunch. Kids go through the park on their way home from school. And then in the evening, office workers leave, passing through the park. And at night, couples and families and friends pass through the park as they're going to movies or shows or restaurants. Jane saw that what made good city streets was the intersections that brought people together. But when she looked closely at parks, she realized it wasn't just enough to create opportunities for intersection. You had to make sure people were actually using those spaces that you created. Otherwise, what's the point? Parks in and of themselves are already public spaces with opportunities to intersect. But a park is not going to be successful if people aren't using it. Creating opportunities for intersection is the first step, and it's important. But you also have to go a little bit further. You have to make sure that you have a continuous intersection of people in a shared space. But how do we decide which people should come together? And how do we get the right intersection of people? To answer these questions, we got to end with buildings. And I know I'm going to pause here because I'm sure you're like, we're like 20 minutes into this thing, we're talking about streets and parks and buildings. How on earth does this tie back to software? Stick with me. I'm going with this somewhere. We're all going together. Urban developers in the 1950s wanted to revitalize neighborhoods by tearing down old buildings and replacing them with new ones. In fact, there's a lot of urban developers who do the same thing today. But Jane strongly advocated against that approach. In her research, she saw that old buildings provided an inherent and embedded value, and it was worth keeping them around in a neighborhood. An old building doesn't carry the same financial burden that a new one does. New buildings, because they're new, haven't paid off their capital costs yet, but old buildings generally have. And the side effect of this is that rents become more affordable, and they're lower. And when rents are lower and space is more affordable, then that neighborhood has opened up to an entirely different group of people. Jane writes, "Old buildings become the shelter which is necessary and valuable to the district." In other words, she is basically saying when neighborhoods have old buildings that are demolished and replaced with entirely new ones, those neighborhoods become unaffordable to lots of people, and they're forced to leave. But when there's a mix of old and new buildings, the people who stayed in that community, who've been in that community, get to stay in that community, and they get to participate and be a part of that neighborhood. They're able to contribute. Including older buildings in a neighborhood ensures that more people can participate in that neighborhood's community. And ensuring a diversity in structures actually leads to a diversity in people. Buildings are a path to bringing diversity to a neighborhood. And yes, it's a diversity of people, but if you think about what we've been talking about so far, there's a diversity in usage, and there's also a diversity in economic opportunity. When a neighborhood doesn't have diverse structures, you can really notice it. Take, for example, my favorite place, the financial district. For the most part, it only has office buildings. There's really only one main use for most of those buildings. They're not diverse. And as a result, people come to this district to work, but they leave. For all intents and purposes, the neighborhood is dead after they leave. There was no one really tending to it. There's no strong, lasting community of people around these buildings in this neighborhood or the public spaces. Compared to the Lower East Side, there's no community in the financial district. And I think that's the heart of what Jane Jacobs saw when she looked at how people interacted with the buildings around them. It's not the buildings themselves that have the value. It's the community created around those buildings. That's what defines these vibrant neighborhoods and vibrant cities. So when an urban developer jumps into a neighborhood and rips out all the buildings, they're also ripping out the community that existed. And any new community that springs up is not going to be the same as the one that was there before. So we've talked a bit about the roles that streets, parks, and buildings play in a city. And hopefully by now, you're starting to see cities through Jane's eyes. In all of her research and observations, Jane was always trying to take the perspective of the people who lived in a space. And she looked at how those people were using those spaces already. And while we're not city planners or urban designers, there is something to learn from Jane. In our organizations, we all inhabit a shared space. Our world is software. Our code base is where our community lives. And in many ways, cities are analogous, or code bases are analogous to cities, and vice versa, I guess. That's what analogous means. Just as a city is a living, breathing entity inhabited by its residents, a code base is a living, breathing entity inhabited by the engineers who exist within it. Our team inhabits our code base. They shape that code base and interact with it. And over time, our teams may change, our residents of our code base may change, but while they're together, they share that space, and they interact with one another, and they intersect in that code base. So how can we apply Jane Jacobs' principles and teachings? How can we take what makes for a vibrant city and apply it to what makes for a vibrant code base? Well, let's think back to what she had to say about streets. She told us that streets were the most vibrant when they brought people together and allowed them to intersect. Think back to that example of long city blocks versus short city blocks. Jane saw that when people were isolated, they didn't interact with their city nearly as much as when they were integrated with one another. She taught us that when a city opened itself up to its residents, those residents could collectively do more and have a stronger, more positive impact when they interacted with one another and the urban fabric. Jane taught us that vibrancy comes from intersections. And how does this translate to our code base? Well, when we allow more people to intersect, share their ideas, and integrate with one another on our teams, they can do more for the collective whole than if they had been isolated. Software teams where individuals are isolated and working in silos are going to have far fewer intersection of ideas. But a team that provides ample ways for people to collaborate, to share knowledge and context, they're ultimately going to have more opportunities as a group to improve and grow. And what can we learn from Jane's observations about parks? Well, she saw that successful, vibrant parks were the ones that had many different people passing through it throughout the whole day. And when different types of people passed through a park, there was a side effect. It ensured that the park was never abandoned or forgotten. Jane taught us that vibrancy comes from a density of people. Of course, density here is going to mean something different based on the size of your organization. But in the context of software development, the healthiest code bases are the ones that have different types of people passing through them. They make use of those spaces, they tend to them, they own those spaces, and they care for them. A code base that has a higher density of people involved is going to be healthier and more vibrant than one where only a few people are involved, and that space gets abandoned and forgotten. When more people are involved in a project, more context and historical knowledge can be shared. Just like a public space, you'll have people inhabiting corners of your code base, and it's less likely that those corners are going to be abandoned. And you can probably think of an example in your own code base. Maybe there is a feature or a service that developers don't want to work on. They're dreading it. Maybe there's technical debt involved. Maybe there's a lack of domain knowledge. Imagine if there were more people passing through that part of your code base. I'd guess it would be healthier and more vibrant. Finally, what can we learn from Jane's observations on buildings? Well, we already know that Jane believed it was important that many people needed to come together and intersect within a city. But we also know it couldn't just be any group of people. There had to be different types of people in a neighborhood for it to truly be vibrant, because all of them had unique perspectives and valuable contributions to that neighborhood's vibrancy. Jane taught us that vibrancy comes from diversity. If you had a diverse range of buildings, then a neighborhood would open up to a much wider range of people. Each of those people would contribute something important and vital to that neighborhood's success. But when a neighborhood was not diverse and it was only inhabited by one type of person, it was not vibrant. And while people like Le Corbusier designed cities with the assumption that every individual was the same and wanted and needed the same things, and you could put them in these tall boxes and they'd all be happy, Jane realized that people are different, and they don't all want and need the same things. And she believed that those differences should be celebrated. It was the diversity of people that contributed to the vibrancy of a city. And the same philosophy can be applied to the people who inhabit our code bases. When people all look the same, have the same skills and backgrounds, they're all going to contribute the same perspectives. But when we open up that shared space to different kinds of people, we allow more voices to participate in the conversation. When we build a team with different kinds of people and life experiences and historical contexts, the entire whole collectively benefits. The whole team gets better. And just as there's value in creating a neighborhood or community that can support a diversity of people, there's value in creating a team that is inclusive of a diverse set of voices, too. While homogeneous teams are often easier to put together, it's a well-supported fact that diverse teams produce much better results in the long run. A team of engineers with diverse backgrounds is going to build a more inclusive product or tool than the team that all looks and thinks and acts the same. You see, Jane realized that a city isn't great because of the spaces that it has. It's great because of how those spaces support its people. Similarly, a software team isn't great because of its code base. It's great because of how it supports the people that live within that code base. If we want to build great software teams, we have to foster and cultivate those healthy interactions. If we are to help our teams truly thrive, then we have to create more opportunities for those intersections of different ideas and thoughts. We have to bring the right density of people together within our teams so that no part of the code base is uninhabited. And it's on us to make sure that we have the right voices, the right diversity of people, so that all of those voices can contribute to shaping that shared space. So, where does that leave our friend Jane? Well, after she published Death and Life of Great American Cities, she continued to guide the entire field of urban planning for over 40 years. She advocated for a humanistic approach to urban design. And she did that throughout her career until 2006, when she passed away at the age of 89. And her teachings are still used to enliven downtown urban centers all over the North American continent, and maybe even beyond. Her writing has directly impacted cities like Toronto, Vancouver, Portland, and of course, New York City. Learning about Jane Jacobs and reading her work has honestly made me see cities and public spaces and frankly, human interaction on a whole in a completely different light. As engineering leaders, it's so important that we keep the human element of our work central to the decisions that we make every day. These days, when I watch interactions on my own team and try to think about why something isn't working within an organization, I try to channel my own inner Jane Jacobs. I try to think about the spaces that we share. And I look closely at the people on our teams and how they're using those spaces, or sometimes not using them. And I consider how I can foster more interactions in the right places and include the right people. But more than anything, Jane has taught me that whether we're dealing with massive cities or teeny tiny engineering teams, the most important thing that we can remember is the inhabitants of these shared spaces. Ultimately, it's about the people on our team. That's why we all showed up here today, right? That's why we do the work we do. And just like changing a city, changing our teams and organizations can take some time. It can be painful and difficult and slow. And sometimes you have to rally a whole bunch of different people to try to get the job done, just like Jane did. But eventually, if we keep at it, we can make these shared spaces better for everyone involved. And if she were alive today, I like to think that Jane herself would agree with that. Thank you.